Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creating Space podcast. My name is Olivia Lancashire, and as a part of my undergraduate research with the Lumen Prize at Elon University, I'm going to be conducting a series of interviews that will explore my current project, the intersection between Christian perspectives on hell and religious trauma. In this podcast series, I will be interviewing a range of expertise, including pastors, counselors, biblical scholars, and psychologists. In doing so, I hope to create space for questions that people are too afraid to talk about. Today, I am joined by Dr. Lynn Huber, who is a scholar, professor, and mentor, and received her doctorate at Emory in Atlanta. She is a Maud Sharp Powell Professor in the Religious Studies Department at Elon University and introduces students to cultural worlds surrounding the New Testament writings. Dr. Huber is an active scholar whose writing focuses on the book of Revelation. She was raised in an evangelical Christian context and was introduced to Revelation really early on in her life. Recently, Dr. Huber completed a feminist commentary on Revelation for the Liturgical Press Wisdom Commentary series. Today, I am honored to lead a conversation with Dr. Lynn Huber, where we will discuss topics related to Christian perspectives on hell, the book of Revelation, and religious trauma. Welcome, Dr. Huber.
Hey there, I'm happy to be here.
Yes, thanks so much for being here. So just to dive right in, my first question is, how did you first learn about hell, and what did that kind of look like in your day-to-day life, being raised in a Christian context?
Yeah, so I don't really remember, the first time I was introduced to hell. It was just kind of always there. I grew up in an evangelical church, like you mentioned, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and it was really a time period in the evangelical church that was really focused on end times thinking. And so there was always this sense of like the rapture could happen and that there would be a last judgment and hell. And both my mom and my aunt, who I was really close to, were really influenced by this kind of thinking. They were really interested in like end time prophecy and aligning like historical and political events with the Bible and thinking about the rapture. So there was always this sense of like hell looming in the background. And if you didn't behave correctly or if you somehow sinned, then you could go to hell.
Yeah.
And I guess you asked about how that impacted my day-to-day life, and it really did, in terms of thinking about like every night praying that I would be forgiven for my sins, even sins that I didn't commit, or no, that I didn't know I'd committed. Like I was worried about kind of accidentally sinning and somehow doing something that I hadn't gotten forgiven for, and then going to hell. And so there was this sort of constant sense of really needing to be okay and be forgiven. And so that's really kind of, I guess, my first idea of hell, this sort of fear of doing something wrong and then going to hell at the last judgment.
Yeah, I can imagine that being so anxiety producing. And I feel like the people that I've talked to, it always kind of seems like that manifests itself in this feeling of needing to control behavior and act a certain way in order to kind of stay away from the consequence, which would be hell in that case.
Yeah. I don't think, and I've shared this in other places. Like I do have a anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive kind of, I have been diagnosed with OCD. And I think that there's a connection there, right? Like, or at least in some sense, it really like hooked me. And so, so this sort of fear of like always doing something wrong, it was kind of looming for me, and needing to make sure that I was sort of morally upright, even when I was really young and like, not doing anything wrong.
Right.
But fearful that somehow I would be sent to hell.
Yeah. And I know individuals that are kind of predisposed to OCD or anxiety. I can just imagine that adding the religion piece would kind of escalate that way bigger than if that wasn't in the picture. Because I think just the idea of having this God, eternal being, kind of looking over and knowing what you're doing would be really anxiety producing. if you already have those tendencies. So it would kind of lead to those compulsions of, oh, I have to make sure I do X, Y, and Z so that I can be, good and not bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, so from a young age, just really trying to, I guess, make sure that every time I did something that was maybe like questionable, trying to catch myself and, making sure I was kind of praying for forgiveness. So, praying for forgiveness became like a regular kind of thing. And, that also, it's the experience of a lot of people I grew up with, too. I mean, I think in some sense, I didn't think it was unusual either because everybody else was doing it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So can you kind of talk about how your experience and learning about hell motivated your work around the Book of Revelation?
Right. That's a good question. It's a big question. So, like I mentioned, I grew up in an evangelical Christian home, and there was a lot of thinking about the end times. And there was also, during that time period, a lot of thinking about the end times. So I worked for my church, doing summer camps, and I was with a group of kids. Like we went all over Oregon and Washington and put on summer camps. And in my denomination, there was this book that was really popular, and it was really popular all over the United States, called 88 Reasons Why Jesus's Return Could Be in 1988, or some kind of like weird title like that, really explicit title. It's just this booklet, but the ideas really took off. This idea that Jesus was going to return in September of 1988. And like my mom wasn't really she always emphasized, that, Jesus's return, like we don't know the time or the day or the hour or whatever. But, when you're with like a group of people and, we were just really into this and this idea. And I was really both suspect of the idea that like we could know Jesus's return, but then also really like worried. But, this is like, my fear, like coming to be, in some sense, like, oh, Jesus's return, we know when it's going to happen, so you better like do everything right. And Jesus didn't return in September of 1988, which was also my I was just starting college, so I was a freshman in college, and a lot of kids at my school were also equally concerned. But Jesus didn't return, and it did sort of get me thinking, and the fact that I think it got me thinking about like what I thought, and what I really believed, and it also got me wondering like why, sort of about like my own suspicions, right? Because one of the things I was concerned about was, because I was suspicious, that was a sign that I wasn't really faithful. And so so it got me interested in questions about religion and belief, and why we believe what we believe. And then eventually, like through a number of different twists and turns, eventually brought me to the study of Revelation when I was in graduate school. When I started graduate school, I wasn't really interested in studying Revelation. I was just interested really in the New Testament, and I had to be persuaded to come back to Revelation, because it was really a traumatic text for me.
Yeah.
It was my mentor in graduate school, Gail O'Day, who it was the only class she was teaching that semester, and she's like, you have to take this class with me, and I think you really need to revisit Revelation. Like, she knew the context I had been raised in, and the apocalyptic kind of thinking I'd been raised around. And so she was like, I really think you need to revisit Revelation, more from an academic perspective. And she also knew I was interested in art, and Revelation is a source for a lot of art. And so she's like, this book is the thing that you need to be studying. So that got me to Revelation, the sort of circuitous route, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Did you see your anxiety kind of shift once you were able to study the book in a space that just with people that were more open to your questions and more open to looking at it from different perspectives?
Yeah, I did. And again, it wasn't sort of like an immediate kind of thing. I think it was I had already begun to sort of look at the Bible more critically and
Yeah.
to think and question the Bible. In college, I started studying Greek, so I was able to start reading the book in its original language, and that kind of helped me like understand some of what this book was about. And then as I studied the New Testament in seminary, I began to, I don't know, just see it in kind of different ways. And then when I came back to Revelation and sat with it, I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, I really had the sense, oh, this book, number one, isn't necessarily just about me, right? Like, this is a book that's being written in the first century, and it's being written to like the author is trying to persuade an audience to a particular point of view and a way of seeing God and Christ. And it's not just all about me, right? And that I can understand and appreciate the book in ways that I couldn't before, and kind of got a sense of what John was doing. It took away some of the scariness of the book, but also the sense that somehow the book was like, I don't know, pinpointing me and kind of like, I don't know. The book kind of had a magic beforehand, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. And so I was able to look at it more critically. Like, I think studying helped dispel the magical powers of the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of with that, I wanted to bring up, here's Dr. Huber's book on Revelation. This is the Wisdom Commentary series.
Mhm.
And I know you mentioned your mentor, Gail O'Day, who also wrote this alongside you.
We started it together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So can you just talk a little bit for those that don't know about what a feminist commentary is, and then also kind of just offer a little sneak peek into the series?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So number one, it is a series. So their liturgical press has a whole they have books dedicated to like every book in the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, and then also like deuterocanonical books, so like Judith, and so books that aren't canonical but are part of kind of Christian scripture and Jewish scripture, and they're all written from a feminist perspective. So that means that they privilege conversations about gender and sexuality, but then also other forms of like power structures. So they often address race and class as well, and disability and ageism and things like that. And so they foreground those questions.
Yeah.
They also, the commentary series and a feminist commentary series often also foregrounds the experiences of women, queer people, children, people who aren't normally included in sort of scholarly conversation. So they foreground our perspectives and are written from that perspective. So it was really wonderful to work on this. And I did start it with my mentor, who sadly passed away right as we began writing. And so finishing it and having her name on it was really kind of important to me. So.
Yeah. Wow. That's so awesome. And I did want to say, I think it's so important for those that might be interested in beginning to study the Bible in a more academic way, just to kind of be open to different types of interpretations of the Bible. I've really found that to be important in my study of just because I did come in as a Christian and with these certain maybe biases, it's important for me to learn from different types of interpretations.
Right.
Because I think that's kind of what helps disrupt the binary thinking that occurs in churches often today. And so I just wanted to say, like, I think this is such a cool resource for people that are starting to study the Bible in a more academic and critical context. So I really think it's awesome that you decided to write this and finish it.
Yeah. I will say, so this one, the commentary that we wrote on Revelation is from a Christian perspective, although obviously a feminist Christian perspective, but not all of them are. And so even though they are by liturgical press, it's a Catholic press, so they're not all Catholic, but they do. And they also, each of the commentaries seeks to include perspectives other than sort of the main authors. So you find in the book, there are like little bits from other short essays from other people to give you a range of perspectives on the text. So
awesome. Yeah, that's such a good resource. Well, I wanted to read one quote from your book. You said, this chapter closes with multiple references to the infamous lake of fire, an image that looms large in Christian depictions of hell. The lake, along with related images of rivers of fire, provides a backdrop for many early Christian tours of hell. So for those that don't know what the tours of hell are, can you talk a little bit about that and how that might influence our current perspective on the Christian idea of hell?
yeah, so the early Christian tours of hell are they're this sort of genre of literature which they're visionary stories where somebody is given, like Peter or Paul, are given a tour of hell by an angel or some sort of otherworldly figure, and they're shown often not just hell but also maybe heaven, but hell is definitely more interesting. And these texts function to really show the audiences what sort of behavior is unacceptable. So they're a way of like controlling behavior. And you and I have talked about these quite a bit. And that sort of one of the main, I guess, one of the main scholars today who's working on these is a scholar named Megan Henning, and she has a great book on early Christian tours of hell, where she goes into them in depth. I don't in this book, in part because Revelation doesn't, which I think is interesting. Like Revelation gives this tantalizing reference to the lake of fire, and it also mentions that people will be judged by their actions, but it doesn't go into like detailing what happens to people, how they are judged, and their experiences in the lake of fire. And these early Christian tours of hell kind of use that little bit in Revelation, and they like expand it, right?
Yeah.
And they use it as an entry into these like ancient kind of horror stories. I mean, you see people, hung up by their hair or being, tortured in different ways that kind of fit the crime. And they become a way of, again, controlling behavior by saying, this is what's ahead for you if you don't sort of reform your ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that kind of goes into the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice, and just how the current Christian perspective on hell of this fire and brimstone really focuses on kind of it's an eye for eye, and you're going to get what you're going to pay for what you've done. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that kind of that distinguishing factor is very important because, like you said, Revelation doesn't go into detail necessarily about eye for eye, but it seems as though we're really influenced by that idea. So would you say that the tours of hell is something that a lot of modern day Christians are influenced by and might not necessarily be aware of it?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I mean, it's interesting because they aren't things that are generally read in modern Christian congregations, and they're not part of like church liturgy or things like that. But the ideas have really been influential, and so I guess they've been taken up by sort of classic Western authors like Dante, and the imagery has been seen in, if you visit Europe and you look at church art and see Last Judgment scenes, you'll see kind of allusions to this kind of judgment. So even though like Christian scripture doesn't necessarily include these traditions of the tours of hell and these tortures, they've become part of the Christian imagination, and they've been passed down through various teachings, but then also through cultural imagination. And so, when you look at like modern representations of hell, even like in cartoons, right? You see hell as like a place with little rooms where people are being tortured in really particular ways. And that comes straight out of these ancient tours of hell. And so they've been really influential in ways that we might not anticipate. And we tend to then ascribe that to Revelation.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I think that is a super valuable insight for those listening that might be interested in kind of moving away from the black and white thinking, because I think when you start to open yourself up to the academic side of the book and kind of understand these cultural contexts and books that come after before it, you kind of start to see the nuance that comes with the book of Revelation alone. And yeah, I think that will help people kind of see the book in a different light than they might in just a church context.
Right. I also think it's interesting, like, to think about, and this is something I'd like to think more about, is like why those ideas have been so powerful,
Yeah.
right? Like, what is it, um, culturally or historically or in individuals that have made these ideas powerful? And I mean, in some sense, I think we like the idea of like a clear cut sense of, like maybe justice or something. Like it's really manageable to think about. Like, oh, if you do X, then X is done to you.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's not in the text that Christian calls, scripture. And I do wonder then, like, what about that then has become so attractive that that's something that people really want to hold on to?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Sometimes I think also, I mean, if you go back to the beginning of just any literature that we have from a long time ago, I think this idea of the afterlife and what happens when we die has been so consistent throughout
Yeah.
humanity, because I think that's something, because we don't know, a lot of people are like trying to come to a conclusion about it. And so I think it's that idea of control a little bit of, if I know what's going to happen to me when I die and how I can make sure that I'm
Right.
safe, then I'm going to cling to that idea for life. And so
Right.
I think that's kind of what has started to happen with this very extreme perception of hell, because I think a lot of people are wanting that control and that certainty about what's going to happen when we're not here.
Yeah, I think the irony is, I think it's a really good observation. I think the irony is like we want control because we're fearful, right? We're fearful of what might happen. So if we know what happens, then we can kind of control it. But at the same time, then we create these fearful fantasies, right? Like we're just like residing in this space of, I don't know, this space of fearfulness. And I mean, I'm not a counselor, obviously, and I'm not a religious leader, but I just think that's such a, I don't know, I don't want to sort of be part of a religion of fear or a fearful way of thinking. It just seems really unproductive. And again, as somebody who has like lived with, anxiety and OCD, like all of that's also kind of about fear. And that's just not a very productive and happy place to be. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I just think it's interesting that we sort of counter fear with narratives that then perpetuate fearfulness.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I was gonna say too, I guess my question would be, do you have any resources for people that are kind of trying to move away from maybe these ideas that perpetuate the fear, and they want to kind of look at it from more of an academic perspective or a critical thinking perspective? What would you kind of offer as a piece of advice or resources to go towards?
Of course, I'm always going to say, like, people should take a New Testament class or a Bible class or somewhere. If you're a college student, I definitely encourage like taking classes, or like turning to your multi-faith center or whatever, where they can offer kind of ways into the topic. There are also a lot of great online resources. You and I have talked a lot about the Bible for Normal People,
Yes.
which is a podcast and online online resource for thinking about the Bible critically. They offer classes, and I know they've offered one recently on hell.
Yeah.
So those are really good resources because you get you get some introduction into where these ideas come from, and in some sense that helps. I think understanding helps you deal with like your own anxieties, and then there are a lot of great books. There's a book, Raising Hell. It's by a chaplain at a small college. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but it's a really good book, Raising Hell,
Yes.
and with a, I think, Razing, Hell.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there's just great resources out there. Another resource that has a good place to sort of begin thinking about the Bible critically is a website called BibleOdyssey.com, and it's sponsored by the Society for Biblical Literature, and all the pieces on it or all the essays on it are written by scholars. And I know that Megan Henning, who I mentioned before, has a piece on hell on there. And it gives you a way into studying the Bible from a more academic perspective. And I think that that can be really helpful.
Yeah, totally. And I will say the Bible Odyssey article that Megan Henning wrote was one of the most influential pieces for me, because it was just the introduction that I needed to be like, oh, wow, these questions that I'm asking really do have value, and there are people that are looking at it critically. And that was just really encouraging to me, because it was less of, oh, I'm the only one thinking this, and more of, oh, wow, there's a whole line of thought of people that are considering these questions. So yeah. That's a great resource.
Yeah. No, there have been 2,000 years of people who've been wondering,
Exactly.
at least, right? I mean, and like you said earlier, like people have, throughout history have been thinking about the afterlife and what happens when we die. And those questions are perennial, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all I have for you today, Dr. Huber. Thank you so much. This was so helpful, and I hope that everyone uses those resources and finds this conversation helpful to their journey of studying the Bible. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.